The afternoon sun cast gentle shadows across the immaculate lawns of Street Mary Mead as the village prepared for what promised to be the most anticipated garden party of the season. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her knitting bag and settled into a comfortable chair positioned strategically near the refreshment table, where she could observe the proceedings with her characteristic quiet attention. At 73, she had learned that the most interesting human dramas often unfolded not in drawing rooms or libraries, but in the seemingly innocent gatherings where people felt most at ease. The occasion was the unveiling of Mr. Nathaniel Reed's latest horticultural achievement, a rose cultivar he had developed through what he described as revolutionary techniques involving ash-based soil enhancement. Mr. Reed, a newcomer to Street Mary Mead, who had arrived 18 months prior with considerable fanfare and even more considerable opinions about traditional gardening methods, stood near the canvas-covered display, with the satisfied air of a man about to prove his superiority to the entire village. Mrs. Dolly Pritchard, settling beside Miss Marple with a flutter of silk and a conspiratorial lean, whispered behind her program, "I do hope his rose is worth all this fuss. He's been quite insufferable about it, you know, going on about ash and soil composition, as if he'd discovered fire itself. Poor Mrs. Vale has had to listen to him, expound on his theories every time she's tried to tend her own garden." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes followed Mrs. Pritchard's gaze to where Mrs. Hester Vale stood with rigid politeness near the display, her expression carefully neutral. Beside her, Charlotte Vale, her stepdaughter, appeared distinctly uncomfortable, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that the leather showed white stress marks at the knuckles. Behind them both, Bernard Pratt, the head gardener at Vale House, maintained his usual position of respectful attention, though Miss Marple noticed his eyes never left Mr. Reed's covered display. The Reverend Miles Goodwin cleared his throat and addressed the small gathering with the gentle authority of a man accustomed to managing village events. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to witness what Mr. Reed assures us is a remarkable achievement in rose cultivation. His new variety, which he has chosen to call the Ashbourne Rose, represents, according to its creator, a completely new approach to nurturing beauty from what others might consider waste." Dr. Thomas Lennox, handsome and precise in his movements, had positioned himself where he could respond quickly to any medical emergencies, though his attention seemed more focused on the social dynamics unfolding before him than on potential health concerns. Mr. Jarvis Blunt, the village chemist, fidgeted with his collar and peered at the covered pot with the intense curiosity of a man who understood the science behind soil composition better than most. Young Lily Finch, the vicar's new maid, moved nervously among the guests with a tray of the vicarage's best china, each cup decorated with delicate rose garlands. Miss Marple noticed that Lily had set aside one cup with a chipped saucer, replacing it with an unblemished piece, and that her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the service. As Mr. Reed prepared for his grand unveiling, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to several small details that others might have overlooked. A fine layer of grey dust clung to the rim of the earthenware pot beneath its covering cloth, and when a slight breeze lifted one corner of the drape, she glimpsed what appeared to be a smudge on one of the plant's leaves, as if someone had handled it with less than perfectly clean fingers. "The secret," Mr. Reed announced with theatrical pleasure, "lies in understanding that death can nourish life, that what we discard as worthless ash can create beauty beyond imagination." With a flourish worthy of a stage magician, he whipped away the white cloth to reveal his creation. The rose that stood before them was undeniably striking. 3 graceful stems rose from rich, dark soil, each crowned with blooms of such deep crimson they appeared almost black in certain lights. The petals had a velvety texture that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and a faint, almost imperceptible dusting of grey powder clung to their edges, giving them an otherworldly quality that was both beautiful and somehow unsettling. "Magnificent," murmured Mrs. Vale, though Miss Marple detected a note of strain in her voice. "Quite unlike anything I've seen before." The gathered villagers pressed closer to admire the unusual blooms, and Lily began serving tea with the careful precision of someone determined not to make any mistakes. Mr. Reed accepted his cup with evident satisfaction, raising it in a toast to his own success. "To innovation," he declared, "and to showing this village that there are always new ways to achieve perfection." It was then that Miss Marple noticed the cat from the vicarage approaching the scattered ash that had drifted from beneath the pot's base. The animal stepped delicately toward the grey powder, sniffed once, and immediately backed away, shaking its paw with the fastidious disgust cats reserve for substances they instinctively recognize as dangerous. Mr. Reed had just taken his first sip of tea when his expression changed. The satisfied smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion, then growing alarm. His hand began to tremble, causing tea to slosh over the rim of his cup and onto his fingers. He made a choking sound, as if something had caught in his throat, and his face began to take on an alarming pallor. "I say," began Dr. Lennox, moving forward with professional concern, but before he could reach the man, Mr. Reed's knees buckled. As he fell, his shoulder struck the earthenware pot, sending it tilting precariously and releasing a cloud of the grey ash into the afternoon air. The fine powder settled over the immediate area like a ghostly snow, dusting the grass, the fallen teacup, and the polished shoes of several onlookers. Dr. Lennox knelt beside the collapsed man, his fingers seeking a pulse at the neck, while the gathered villagers stood in shocked silence. "Fetch water," Dr. Lennox commanded, his voice carrying the authority of medical training. But Miss Marple could see from his expression that it was already too late. Mr. Reed lay still, his eyes fixed unseeing on the summer sky, while beside him his prized rose continued to nod gently in the breeze, its dark petals now seeming less beautiful than ominous. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting needle still in her hands, but her attention was completely focused on the scene before her. She observed the pattern of the spilled tea, which had run toward the lowest point of the ground where it mixed with a small puddle of the grey substance that had leaked from the pot. She noted Lily's white-faced terror, and the way her thumb bore a small cut from the chipped saucer she had so carefully set aside. Most importantly, she saw how Bernard Pratt was staring not at the fallen man, but at the sole of his own shoe, where a light dusting of the ash had settled. "Heart failure. Most likely," Dr. Lennox announced quietly, rising from his examination. "Though, the timing is certainly unfortunate." Mrs. Pritchard clutched Miss Marple's arm. "How dreadful. And at such a peaceful gathering. One never knows, does one, when such things might happen?" "No," Miss Marple agreed softly, her eyes still taking in every detail of the scene. Though sometimes, if one pays attention, one might notice that even the most unexpected events follow their own particular logic. As the village constable was summoned, and the guests began to disperse in hushed, shocked groups, Miss Marple continued to sit quietly beneath the oak tree. She watched as young Peter Lacey, the vicar's son, slipped something into his pocket, something small and wooden that he had found near the overturned pot. She observed the way Charlotte Vale kept glancing not at the body, but at the scattered ash, and how Mrs. Vale's hand shook as she attempted to comfort her stepdaughter. The afternoon that had begun with such promise of horticultural triumph had ended in tragedy. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that in villages like Street Mary Mead, tragedy rarely arrived without invitation. As the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened across the disrupted garden party, she folded her knitting carefully and prepared to discover just who had extended that invitation and why. The constable arrived within the hour, his bicycle wheels crunching over the scattered ash that had drifted across the vicarage drive. Constable Rowan possessed the steady temperament that served Street Mary Mead well during its usual emergencies of lost cats and boundary disputes. Reed's still form beneath the hastily borrowed tablecloth clearly tested the limits of his experience. He consulted his notebook with the careful precision of a man determined not to overlook any detail, though his questions revealed a touching faith in the simplicity of village life. Dr. Lennox repeated his assessment of heart failure with professional certainty, yet Miss Marple noticed how his gaze lingered on the spilled grey powder with something approaching unease. When Constable Rowan suggested that the teacups be gathered as a precaution, the doctor nodded with perhaps more enthusiasm than the suggestion warranted. By morning, the post office had become the unofficial headquarters for speculation. Mrs. Clement held court behind her counter, dispensing theories along with the Morning Post. Mark my words. It was the excitement, she declared to her assembled audience. All that fuss about his revolutionary methods, and his heart simply couldn't bear the strain of the moment. Mrs. Pritchard, examining a letter with unnecessary attention, shook her head decisively. I've seen that look before. My late husband turned exactly that shade when he encountered shellfish. Some sort of reaction, I'd say, though to what I couldn't begin to guess. Mr. Jarvis Blunt, who had arrived early with the determined air of a man seeking answers, looked up from his morning purchases. Reaction to tea. The man had been drinking it for 70 years. But his voice carried a note of professional curiosity that suggested other possibilities had occurred to him. Miss Marple, ostensibly selecting writing paper, positioned herself where she could observe the various speakers. Missus Vale had entered quietly during the discussion, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of a restless night. Perhaps it was something in that peculiar soil mixture, she suggested with studied casualness. He was always experimenting with different compositions. Young Peter Lacey burst through the door with news that sent a ripple of excitement through the gathering. There's a proper inspector come down from Much Benham. Inspector Craddock, his name is. He's at the vicarage asking all sorts of questions. The name carried weight that Constable Rowan's presence had not. Inspector Craddock was known to be thorough, methodical, and not given to unnecessary investigations. His arrival suggested that yesterday's tragedy might be more complex than a simple heart attack at a garden party. Inspector Craddock? Mrs. Vale's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her handbag. How very thorough of them, though I cannot imagine what any of us could tell him that would prove useful. Miss Marple observed the various reactions with quiet interest. Mrs. Pritchard appeared delighted at the prospect of being questioned by a real detective, while Mr. Blunt seemed to find the floor tiles suddenly fascinating. Most telling was Charlotte Vale's entrance at that moment, her face flushed from hurrying, announcing that the inspector wished to speak with them at 11. As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage. Noting how Peter's hand moved instinctively to his pocket when he mentioned finding the inspector there, the same pocket where she had seen him place that small wooden object yesterday afternoon. The vicarage garden bore subtle evidence of the previous day's disruption. The overturned pot had been removed, but a dark stain remained on the grass. The pattern of footprints in the soft earth suggested that someone had returned to examine the area after the official response had concluded. Dr. Lennox emerged from the vicarage as she approached, his expression thoughtful. The inspector is very thorough, he said carefully. He's asked me to arrange for a more detailed examination. Routine in cases of sudden death, he explained. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, but she had caught the slight hesitation in his voice. As he walked away, she noticed him pause to examine his shoes, brushing at traces of that distinctive grey dust. From within the vicarage came the measured cadence of Inspector Craddock's questions and the higher pitch of Lily Finch's nervous responses. The young maid's distress seemed disproportionate to a routine witness statement, suggesting that her connection to yesterday's events might be more significant than anyone had yet realized. Settling on a garden bench to await her turn, Miss Marple reflected on the curious fact that a simple heart attack had warranted such immediate and thorough official attention. In her experience, routine procedures rarely required senior inspectors, unless there was something decidedly non-routine about the circumstances. The morning sun revealed that where the ash had scattered, the grass was already showing signs of distress, its green blades yellowing at the tips. Whatever Mr. Reed had used in his revolutionary mixture was clearly more potent than ordinary wood ash. Inspector Craddock emerged from the vicarage with the measured pace of a man accustomed to unraveling complex situations. His quiet competence had already begun to transform the morning's atmosphere from village gossip to serious inquiry, and Miss Marple observed how the gathered residents instinctively adjusted their behavior in his presence. The inspector brought with him not just authority, but a methodical approach that suggested he viewed yesterday's events with considerably more skepticism than Dr. Lennox's initial diagnosis had warranted. A police photographer had arrived from Much Benham, methodically documenting the scene where Mr. Reed had collapsed. The man worked with scientific precision, capturing not only the obvious details, but also the subtle evidence that remained. The faint staining on the grass where tea had mixed with the mysterious ash, the pattern of footprints in the soft earth, and the lingering gray residue that clung to nearby foliage. Inspector Craddock supervised this process with careful attention, occasionally directing the photographer's focus to details that might have escaped casual observation. The first formal interview had been with Lily Finch, and when the young maid emerged from the vicarage study, her distress was evident in every line of her posture. Her hands trembled as she clutched a handkerchief, and she avoided meeting anyone's gaze as she hurried toward the kitchen entrance. Whatever questions the inspector had posed had clearly unsettled her far beyond what might be expected from a routine witness statement. Mrs. Hester Vale was summoned next, and she approached the interview with her characteristic composure intact, though Miss Marple detected a subtle tension in the way she held her shoulders. The conversation that followed, though conducted behind closed doors, occasionally revealed itself through tone, if not content. Mrs. Vale's responses carried the measured cadence of someone choosing her words with particular care, and when she emerged 30 minutes later, her face bore the slight flush of someone who had been required to defend positions she had not expected to justify. It was during Mrs. Vale's interview that Bernard Pratt arrived at the vicarage gate, his usual deference replaced by obvious agitation. The head gardener's work clothes bore fresh stains of the grey powder, and his weathered hands gestured emphatically as he spoke to Constable Rowan. Miss Marple could see that whatever had brought Bernard here was urgent enough to overcome his natural reluctance to involve himself in official matters. When Inspector Craddock emerged to investigate the disturbance, Bernard's concerns became immediately clear. "Inspector, I need to show you something about that soil mixture. I've been thinking about it all night. And it's not what Mr. Reed claimed it was." The gardener led them to a small shed behind the vicarage, where the remains of the special soil had been carefully collected. When Bernard opened the container holding the earthenware fragments and ash samples, the acrid smell that emerged was distinctly unpleasant. Nothing like the clean scent of wood ash from a domestic fire. "This is bone ash," Bernard announced with the authority of 30 years gardening experience. "Ground bone, most likely from crematorium remains. I've encountered it before when I worked at the cemetery in Much Benham. It can be used for soil enhancement, but you have to understand the source and handle it properly." Inspector Craddock's expression sharpened considerably. "Are you suggesting this material could be harmful?" "Depends entirely on what kind of bones and what treatments they might have received," Bernard replied grimly. "Crematorium ash isn't always pure. If it came from someone who'd been treated with certain medicines, or if there were other substances mixed in during the process, it could contain compounds that weren't meant for garden use." The implications of this revelation settled over the small group with uncomfortable weight. Mr. Reed's revolutionary gardening methods suddenly appeared less innovative than potentially dangerous, and the question of where he had obtained such materials became considerably more pressing. At that moment, Mr. Jarvis Blunt arrived, carrying his professional case, his spectacles glinting with scientific curiosity. "Dr. Lennox asked for my assistance with a preliminary analysis," he explained to Inspector Craddock. "Most unusual circumstances, from what I understand." The chemist's involvement confirmed that the official investigation had moved well beyond routine procedures. As he disappeared into the vicarage with his testing materials, Miss Marple reflected on how quickly a simple garden party tragedy had evolved into something requiring scientific analysis and expert consultation. Young Peter Lacey chose this moment to appear around the corner of the house, his face flushing when he encountered the assembled adults. Inspector Craddock's attention fixed on the boy immediately, and Miss Marple watched with interest as Peter's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket. "Peter, I believe you found something yesterday near where Mr. Reed's pot overturned," the inspector said with gentle authority. The boy nodded reluctantly and produced a small wooden object from his pocket. It appeared to be a cork or stopper, darkly stained and bearing traces of the same grey powder that had caused such concern. "Found it right where the pot fell over," Peter said defensively. "Didn't think it was important at first, but it seemed odd, being there with all that ash." Inspector Craddock examined the cork carefully, turning it over in his hands to study the staining pattern. Miss Marple observed that the object appeared to have been designed to seal something, and its presence among the scattered soil suggested it had been contained within or near Mr. Reed's special mixture. When Inspector Craddock finally invited Miss Marple into the vicarage study for her interview, she found herself facing a man whose initial assumptions about yesterday's events had clearly undergone significant revision. He settled across from her with his notebook balanced on his knee, his manner suggesting genuine respect for her observations, rather than mere courtesy toward an elderly witness. "I understand you were present throughout yesterday's events," he began. "Dr. Lennox mentioned that you seemed to notice details that others might have overlooked." Miss Marple adjusted her knitting bag thoughtfully. "At my age, Inspector, one learns that small things often prove more significant than obvious ones." She described the cat's instinctive reaction to the scattered ash, the pattern of the spilled tea, and the various behavioral responses she had observed from the gathered witnesses. The inspector made careful notes, his pen pausing when she mentioned her observations of Peter's discovery and the subtle ways different people had reacted to the presence of the gray powder. "You have a remarkable eye for detail, Miss Marple. In your opinion, did anything about yesterday's events strike you as particularly unusual? Beyond the tragic outcome, you mean?" Miss Marple's pale blue eyes met his steadily. "Only that Mr. Reed seemed so very certain of his success, and that several people appeared more familiar with his methods than their public reactions suggested." As she spoke, the sound of footsteps in the hall announced Dr. Lennox's arrival, carrying his medical bag with an air of official business. Through the study window, Miss Marple could see Charlotte Vale approaching the vicarage gate, her face pale and her movements betraying the same nervous tension that had marked her behavior the previous day. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with the expression of a man who had just confirmed that his straightforward case of natural death had become something considerably more complex. The morning's revelations about bone ash, mysterious stoppers, and suspicious behavior patterns had transformed yesterday's garden party tragedy into the opening moves of a much more serious investigation. Dr. Lennox returned to the vicarage study with the measured urgency of a medical professional who had discovered something significant but wished to proceed with appropriate caution. His consultation with Mr. Blunt had yielded preliminary results that cast yesterday's tragedy in an increasingly sinister light, though he was careful to present his findings with the scientific restraint that Inspector Craddock clearly appreciated. "The initial analysis suggests the presence of plant alkaloids in the ash sample, Dr. Lennox reported, setting his medical bag down with deliberate precision. "Mr. Blunt requires more sophisticated testing to identify the specific compounds, but the concentrations are concerning. Such substances, if ingested, could certainly cause the rapid cardiovascular collapse we witnessed." Inspector Craddock absorbed this information with the grim satisfaction of a man whose suspicions were being methodically confirmed. The transformation from accidental death to probable murder had been swift, but the evidence was building with undeniable logic. Plant alkaloids suggests deliberate introduction rather than accidental contamination, he observed. The question becomes, how such material reached Mr. Reed? Charlotte Vale's interview, when it finally commenced, revealed layers of family tension that had remained carefully concealed beneath the surface of village politeness. She entered the study with visible effort to maintain her composure, though her hands betrayed her anxiety through their constant movement, smoothing her skirt, adjusting her gloves, and fidgeting with the clasp of her handbag. The inspector's questions began gently, focusing on her relationship with Mr. Reed and her knowledge of his gardening methods. Charlotte's responses revealed a man who had made himself thoroughly unwelcome at Vale House through his persistent criticism of their traditional gardening approaches and his barely concealed contempt for what he termed amateur methods. He had very strong opinions about proper soil management, Charlotte explained, her voice carrying the strain of someone choosing words carefully. He believed our head gardener, Bernard, was using outdated techniques that were actually harmful to plant growth. There were several rather heated discussions about property boundaries and the effects of our gardening practices on his experimental plots. More significantly, Charlotte reluctantly admitted to a growing dispute between Mr. Reed and her stepmother regarding water rights and the positioning of certain plantings near their shared fence line. Hester found his attitude insufferable. She confessed, then immediately appeared to regret the admission. Not that she would ever do anything inappropriate, of course. She simply felt that a newcomer should show more respect for established residents. When Inspector Craddock pressed for details about yesterday's tea service, Charlotte's discomfort became more pronounced. She confirmed that she had observed Lily's careful preparation of the refreshments and had noticed the young maid's attention to detail in replacing the chipped saucer. More interestingly, she admitted to a brief conversation with her stepmother just before Mr. Reed's collapse, during which Mrs. Vale had made what Charlotte described as an odd comment about patience being rewarded. Following Charlotte's departure, Inspector Craddock sought out Lily Finch for a more detailed examination of the tea service arrangements. The young maid's earlier distress had evolved into a state of barely controlled anxiety that suggested she was harboring information of considerable importance. Under gentle but persistent questioning, Lily revealed a detail that sent ripples of significance through the investigation. "I had arranged all the cups in a perfect row, handles to the right as the Reverend prefers," she explained, her voice trembling with the effort of precise recollection. "But when I turned back from speaking with Mrs. Vale about my mother's health, one cup had been moved. The one with the darker rose pattern had shifted from the end position to the middle of the arrangement. The significance of this observation was not lost on Inspector Craddock. If someone had deliberately repositioned a specific cup, it suggested premeditation and careful planning rather than spontaneous action. "Did you notice who might have moved the cup?" he asked. Lily's face crumpled with distress. "I cannot say for certain, sir. Several people were near the table during those few moments. Mrs. Vale was there, of course, and Mr. Reed himself was examining the arrangement quite closely. Lennox had stepped over to speak with the Reverend, and even young Peter was hovering about, hoping for an early taste of the refreshments. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from her position near the window, interjected with characteristic gentleness. "But you did notice something else, didn't you, my dear? Something about which cup Mr. Reed ultimately selected?" "Yes, ma'am," Lily whispered. "He took up the cup with the darker roses, the one that had been moved, and he drank from it immediately, without waiting for sugar or milk as most people do." This revelation provided a crucial piece of the puzzle. If the poison had been introduced into a specific cup, the perpetrator would have needed to ensure that Mr. Reed received that particular piece of china. The deliberate repositioning of the cups suggested someone with intimate knowledge of both Mr. Reed's habits and the tea service arrangements. Constable Rowan's return from Mr. Reed's cottage brought additional evidence that further complicated the emerging picture. Among the deceased man's papers, he had discovered not only seed catalogues and gardening journals, but also a series of correspondence that revealed the true source of his experimental materials. "Found this tucked behind his desk blotter, sir," Constable Rowan announced, producing a folded invoice. "From Hartwell and Sons, Crematorium Services, Much Benham. Itemized charges for specialty ash preparations delivered monthly for the past 6 months. Seems our Mr. Reed was purchasing cremated remains on a regular basis." The invoice provided disturbing confirmation of Bernard Pratt's suspicions about the nature of the bone ash. More significantly, it established that Mr. Reed's experimental methods were not only dangerous but potentially illegal, depending on the source and handling of the cremated materials. Inspector Craddock studied the document with growing concern. This suggests a pattern of reckless behavior that might have made enemies beyond simple gardening disputes. If Mr. Reed was using improperly obtained crematorium ash, he could have been violating health regulations and potentially desecrating human remains. Miss Marple, who had been following these revelations with quiet attention, found herself reflecting on the peculiar combination of scientific recklessness and village tensions that had created the circumstances for tragedy. Mr. Reed's arrogance and dangerous methods had clearly generated resentment among his neighbors, but the specific targeting suggested by the moved teacup indicated something more personal and calculated than general disapproval. As the afternoon progressed and the evidence accumulated, the investigation began to focus increasingly on the relationships within the Vale household and the complex dynamics that had developed around Mr. Reed's unwelcome presence in the village. The wooden stopper, the repositioned teacup, and the pattern of access to both the tea service and knowledge of Mr. Reed's habits all pointed towards someone with intimate familiarity with the social arrangements of Street Mary Mead. Yet Miss Marple sensed that the most crucial revelations remained hidden beneath the surface of what had been discovered. The careful orchestration of events suggested a mind capable of both patience and ruthless calculation, qualities that might not be immediately apparent in the gentle social interactions of village life. As Inspector Craddock prepared for the next phase of his investigation, she reflected on how often the most dangerous predators were those who had learned to hide their true nature behind masks of respectability and concern. The late afternoon sun cast longer shadows across the vicarage garden, where the stain left by Mr. Reed's spilled tea and scattered ash served as a dark reminder that even in the most peaceful settings, human nature could harbor deadly secrets. The investigation was gathering momentum, but Miss Marple knew from long experience that the final revelation would require not just the accumulation of evidence, but a deeper understanding of the psychological forces that had driven someone to transform a garden party into the stage for murder. The afternoon brought a revelation that transformed the scattered pieces of evidence into a more coherent, though deeply troubling, picture. Inspector Craddock had sent Constable Rowan to make inquiries about the tea service arrangements, and the response from the vicarage housekeeper proved illuminating in ways that cast the previous day's events in an increasingly sinister light. Mrs. Vale had indeed contributed 3 additional cups and saucers that morning, lending them to ensure adequate service for the garden party guests. When the borrowed china was returned after the tragic events, however, one piece was conspicuously absent, the cup bearing the darker rose pattern, the very vessel from which Mr. Reed had taken his fatal drink. The missing cup suggested not carelessness in the aftermath of tragedy, but deliberate removal of evidence that might have revealed the method of poison delivery. Mr. Jarvis Blunt emerged from his preliminary analysis with findings that confirmed the investigation's darkest suspicions. The chemist's usually steady hands showed a faint tremor as he reported his results to Inspector Craddock, and his professional excitement was tempered by obvious unease about the implications of his discoveries. "The alkaloid is definitely from the aconitum family," he announced, consulting his carefully written notes. "Monkshood, most likely, though I would require more sophisticated testing to determine the exact preparation method. What concerns me most is the concentration. This was not accidental contamination, Inspector. Someone prepared a highly concentrated extract with considerable skill." Dr. Lennox, who had remained to hear the results, nodded grimly at this confirmation. "Monkshood grows in several village gardens, though most people treat it with appropriate caution. The plant has been used medicinally for centuries, but the margin between therapeutic and lethal doses is extremely narrow." Inspector Craddock absorbed this information while considering the implications for his investigation. The use of monkshood suggested someone with botanical knowledge and access to the plant, which narrowed the field of potential suspects considerably. More significantly, the sophisticated preparation indicated premeditation and careful planning rather than a crime of passion. Bernard Pratt, summoned back for additional questioning, confirmed what the investigators had begun to suspect. "There's been a fine stand of monkshood at Vale House for as long as I've worked there," he admitted reluctantly. "Mrs. Vale inherited it with the property and never wanted it removed, despite my suggestions about safety. Charlotte has always admired the blue flowers, and we've managed it carefully over the years." The gardener's weathered face showed genuine distress as he continued. "Mr. Reed knew about it, of course. He made several comments about the plant's properties, always in that superior tone of his. Said most people didn't understand the potential of what grew in their own gardens." This revelation provided both motive and means, but Inspector Craddock found himself troubled by the theatrical nature of the crime. If Mrs. Vale had decided to eliminate her troublesome neighbor, why choose such a public venue and such a traceable method? The choice suggested either desperate recklessness or calculated confidence that suspicion would not fall upon the perpetrator. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing these developments, requested permission to return Charlotte's handkerchief, which the young woman had dropped during her agitated arrival at the vicarage. Inspector Craddock, recognizing the value of her observational skills, readily agreed to what appeared to be a simple social courtesy. Vale House received Miss Marple with its usual gracious hospitality, though she detected an underlying tension that had not been present during her previous visits. Mrs. Vale conducted her to the morning room, where the windows provided an excellent view of the north border and the monkshood that grew there in stately blue spikes. "Such a handsome plant," Miss Marple observed, settling into the offered chair with her characteristic gentle manner. Though one must always remember that nature's most beautiful creations often carry the greatest dangers. Mrs. Vale's smile remained perfectly controlled, but Miss Marple noticed how her fingers drummed silently against the arm of her chair. Bernard has always been overly cautious about the monkshood. It has grown there for generations, without causing any difficulties. The conversation continued in the polite, seemingly inconsequential manner that Miss Marple had perfected over decades of social observation. Yet, she noticed several details that might have escaped less attentive notice. A small glass tray on the side table bore the faint ring marks of recently removed items, and beside it lay a cut crystal-smelling salts bottle with its silver stopper slightly askew. Most significantly, an older brown glass vial stood unstoppered nearby, its neck showing traces of the same grayish residue they had found in the scattered ash. When Charlotte joined them for tea, Miss Marple observed the young woman's hands with particular attention. Two small reddened marks along Charlotte's index finger resembled the minor injuries one might sustain from handling thorny plants or working with caustic substances. More telling was Charlotte's nervous attention to the tea service, adding sugar with unusual generosity and drawing the pot away almost immediately, as if anxious about proper brewing time. "I noticed yesterday that the vicarage required additional china," Miss Marple mentioned casually. "Such a thoughtful gesture to supplement their service." "It was nothing," Mrs. Vale replied, though her voice carried a slight strain. Lily seemed quite concerned about having adequate pieces for all the guests. "The cup with the darker roses appears to have gone missing," Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence. "I dare say it will turn up eventually. These things often do." For the first time, Mrs. Vale's composure showed a hairline crack. Her eyes met Miss Marple's directly, and in that moment, a silent communication passed between them. "If it remains lost, I shall certainly replace it," she said finally. "Charlotte can spare another from her collection." As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she reflected on the careful orchestration that had been required to execute yesterday's crime. The poisoner had needed intimate knowledge of monkshood preparation, access to the plant itself, familiarity with the social arrangements of the garden party, and the opportunity to manipulate the tea service without detection. Most crucially, they had required detailed knowledge of Mr. Reed's habits and preferences, particularly his tendency to drink tea immediately without adding milk or sugar. The evidence was building systematically toward Vale House, yet Miss Marple sensed that the most important revelation remained hidden beneath the surface of apparent facts. The missing teacup, the botanical expertise, and the family tensions all pointed in an obvious direction. But her long experience had taught her that obvious solutions in Street Mary Mead often concealed more complex truths. Inspector Craddock's methodical approach was yielding results, but Miss Marple suspected that the final revelation would require not just the accumulation of physical evidence, but a deeper understanding of the psychological dynamics that had driven someone to transform horticultural knowledge into an instrument of death. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across the village, and she could sense that the investigation was approaching a crucial juncture, where careful observation and patient deduction would reveal which of Street Mary Mead's residents had possessed both the means and the cold determination to orchestrate Mr. Reed's carefully planned demise. As she walked back toward the vicarage, Miss Marple carried with her not just the confirmation of botanical access and suspicious behavior, but also the growing certainty that the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove more complex and more tragic than the straightforward case of neighborly resentment that the evidence seemed to suggest. The evening brought Inspector Craddock back to the vicarage study, where he spread the accumulated evidence across the Reverend's desk with the methodical precision of a man assembling a complex puzzle. The brown glass vial recovered from Vale House sat beside the wooden stopper Peter had discovered, their perfect fit providing an undeniable physical connection between the poison preparation and the scene of Mr. Reed's collapse. Mr. Blunt's final analysis had confirmed not only the presence of concentrated aconitum alkaloids, but also their sophisticated preparation, indicating someone with considerable botanical and chemical knowledge. Dr. Lennox arrived with additional information that, rather than complicating the investigation, served to underscore its sinister nature. His consultation with Mr. Reed's physician in Much Benham had revealed the deceased man's history of cardiac irregularity and his dangerous habit of self-medication with plant extracts. The concentration of alkaloids we found was far beyond anything Reed would have used therapeutically. "Doctor," Lennox explained gravely, "this was not experimental accident, Inspector. Someone prepared a lethal dose with deliberate intent." The confirmation that murder had indeed been committed lent new urgency to the physical evidence that continued to emerge. Constable Rowan returned from the mill pond with news that would prove crucial to understanding the killer's desperate attempts at concealment. The dragging operation had recovered not only fragments of the missing teacup but also a small linen bundle containing additional porcelain shards and what appeared to be the remains of a glass dropper. "Found this caught in the reeds as well," Constable Rowan announced, producing a damp triangle of fine linen that bore the delicate scent of violets. Miss Marple examined the fabric with quiet attention, recognizing the quality of the material and the distinctive fragrance that had lingered in the morning room at Vale House. Bernard Pratt's discovery in the compost heap provided another piece of the concealment puzzle. The head gardener had arrived at the vicarage with soil-stained hands and barely contained agitation, carrying evidence that someone had attempted to burn additional traces of the crime. Embedded in the fresh ash he had uncovered were charred fragments of dark blue porcelain and a partially melted plant label bearing the Latin name for monkshood. "Whoever did this knew the grounds well enough to use the compost for disposal," Bernard said, his weathered face showing the strain of having his beloved garden implicated in such darkness. "But they didn't understand that ash burns differently depending on what's in it. The porcelain fragments wouldn't break down completely, and the plant label was treated with waterproof ink." Inspector Craddock studied the recovered evidence with growing certainty about the crime's orchestration, yet Miss Marple detected in his manner the same unease that had begun to trouble her own thoughts. The physical evidence pointed inexorably toward Vale House, but the very neatness of that conclusion stirred her instinctive suspicion of obvious solutions. When Mrs. Vale and Charlotte arrived for their formal interview, the contrast in their demeanor was immediately apparent. Mrs. Vale maintained her characteristic composure, answering Inspector Craddock's questions with measured precision, while Charlotte appeared increasingly distressed, her hands betraying nervous tension despite her efforts at self-control. "The vial was indeed mine," Mrs. Vale acknowledged when confronted with the evidence. "I had prepared a liniment for rheumatic pain, using traditional methods passed down in my family. If someone has misused it for harmful purposes, I can only express my horror at such a perversion of healing knowledge." Her explanation was plausible, even admirable in its suggestion of innocent domestic medicine. Yet Miss Marple observed how Charlotte's face had gone ashen during her stepmother's calm recitation. The young woman's fingers, bearing those telltale reddened marks, twisted in her lap as she avoided meeting anyone's gaze directly. Inspector Craddock pressed for details about access to the monkshood and the preparation methods, but Mrs. Vale's responses remained frustratingly reasonable. She acknowledged the plant's presence in her garden, admitted to knowledge of its properties, and expressed appropriate concern about its dangers. Yet beneath her cooperative demeanor, Miss Marple sensed the careful calculation of someone who had anticipated these questions and prepared suitable answers. As the interview concluded, and the Vale women prepared to leave, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on a curious detail that had emerged from Lily Finch's earlier testimony. The young maid had mentioned delivering a note from Mrs. Vale to Mr. Reed on the morning of the garden party, a note that had carried the distinctive scent of violets. The same fragrance that clung to the handkerchief fragment recovered from the mill pond suggested a connection that went beyond coincidence. The evening shadows deepened over Street Mary Mead as Inspector Craddock prepared for what appeared to be the final phase of his investigation. The evidence against Mrs. Vale seemed overwhelming. Motive, means, opportunity, and now physical proof linking her household to the poison preparation and subsequent concealment efforts. Yet Miss Marple carried with her a growing conviction that the most important revelation remained hidden beneath the surface of apparent facts. In her long experience with village mysteries, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood how to manipulate not just evidence, but expectations. As she walked home through the quiet streets, Miss Marple reflected on how perfectly the investigation had been guided toward its seemingly inevitable conclusion, and wondered whether that very perfection might itself be the most telling clue of all. The truth, when it finally emerged, would reveal not just a murderer, but someone who had possessed both the knowledge to commit the crime and the psychological sophistication to ensure that suspicion fell exactly where it was intended to fall. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, but Miss Marple suspected that the real drama would unfold in ways that would surprise even Inspector Craddock's methodical investigation. The morning brought Dr. Lennox to the vicarage with a discovery that would fundamentally alter the investigation's trajectory, though not in the way anyone might have anticipated. His usually composed manner showed signs of genuine concern as he set his medical bag down in the study, accompanied by a small leather portfolio that he handled with particular care. "Inspector, I've been reviewing the toxicology results with a colleague in London, Doctor," Lennox announced, his professional demeanor unable to completely mask his unease. "The concentration of alkaloids we found suggests something far more sophisticated than a simple poisoning. The preparation method indicates someone with considerable botanical and chemical knowledge, but more troubling still, the dosage was calculated with precision that speaks to intimate familiarity with the victim's medical condition." Inspector Craddock examined the detailed analysis that Dr. Lennox had brought, noting the technical annotations that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. The poison had been prepared not just to kill, but to kill Mr. Reed specifically, taking into account his known cardiac irregularities and his dangerous habit of self-medication with plant extracts. This was not the work of an angry neighbor seeking crude revenge, but the calculated action of someone who understood both chemistry and their victim's vulnerabilities. Miss Marple, observing from her quiet corner, reflected on how this revelation cast the previous day's evidence in an entirely different light. The missing teacup, the repositioned china, and the careful timing all suggested someone who had studied Mr. Reed's habits with scientific precision. Yet she found herself troubled by a nagging sense that the investigation was being guided rather than discovered, as if each revelation had been carefully prepared for their consumption. Her concerns deepened when Charlotte Vale arrived at the vicarage, ostensibly to inquire about the investigation's progress, but displaying a nervous energy that seemed disproportionate to simple concern for her family's reputation. Miss Marple observed how Charlotte's attention fixed immediately on Dr. Lennox's portfolio, and how her relief upon hearing about the sophisticated preparation seemed oddly specific, as if she had been expecting exactly this type of analysis. "How dreadful that someone should have possessed such knowledge," Charlotte murmured, though Miss Marple detected something rehearsed in her tone. "One would never suspect that anyone in our quiet village could be capable of such calculation." It was then that Miss Marple noticed a detail that would prove crucial to understanding the true nature of the deception they were confronting. As Charlotte adjusted her gloves, a small piece of paper fell from her pocket, landing near Miss Marple's chair. The fragment bore traces of the same violet scent that had marked several pieces of evidence, but more significantly, it contained what appeared to be notes written in Charlotte's own hand, detailing the properties of various plant alkaloids and their effects on cardiac patients. When Miss Marple quietly retrieved the paper and examined it more closely, she realized that Charlotte's knowledge of botanical chemistry was far more extensive than anyone had suspected. The notes included precise calculations for dosages, detailed observations about absorption rates through different methods of administration, and most tellingly, specific references to Mr. Reed's medical history and medication schedule. Inspector Craddock, when Miss Marple discreetly shared this discovery, immediately grasped its significance. If Charlotte possessed such detailed knowledge, it suggested that the sophisticated preparation Dr. Lennox had identified might not have required an outside expert after all. More troubling still, It raised questions about whether the evidence pointing toward Mrs. Vale had been deliberately planted by someone with intimate access to the household and detailed knowledge of the investigation's likely direction. The afternoon brought another crucial development when Lily Finch, emboldened by what appeared to be a shift in the investigation's focus, approached Miss Marple with information she had previously been too frightened to share. The young maid's revelation concerned not just the morning of the garden party, but a series of conversations she had overheard during the weeks leading up to Mr. Reed's death. "Miss Marple, I've been so afraid to speak," Lily confessed, her voice trembling with the weight of her secret. "But I heard Miss Charlotte talking to someone on the telephone several times, always when Mrs. Vale was out. She would speak very quietly about solving the Reed problem permanently, and about making sure the evidence would point in the right direction when the time came." More significantly, Lily revealed that she had seen Charlotte preparing what appeared to be botanical extracts in the conservatory, working with plants from the garden and consulting books about plant chemistry. The young maid had assumed it was related to Charlotte's interest in natural remedies, but the secretive nature of the work and Charlotte's nervousness, when discovered, had struck her as unusual. Miss Marple listened to these revelations with growing understanding of the psychological complexity that had driven the crime. Charlotte's actions suggested not just premeditation, but a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate Mr. Reed, while ensuring that suspicion fell upon her stepmother. The motive appeared to go beyond simple neighborly disputes, pointing toward something more personal and more desperate. When Inspector Craddock confronted Charlotte with this new evidence, her carefully maintained composure finally cracked. The young woman's face went ashen as she realized that her elaborate deception had been discovered, and her hands began to tremble with the same nervous energy that had marked her behavior throughout the investigation. "You don't understand," Charlotte said, her voice breaking with emotion. "He was going to destroy everything, not just with his horrible gardening methods, but with what he knew about our family. He had discovered something about my father's business dealings, something that would have ruined Hester's reputation and left us with nothing." The confession that followed revealed the true motive behind the elaborate murder plot. Mr. Reed had uncovered evidence of financial irregularities in Charlotte's late father's estate, irregularities that Mrs. Vale had concealed to protect both their reputations and their financial security. Reed had been using this knowledge to demand increasingly unreasonable concessions regarding property boundaries and gardening disputes, threatening to expose the scandal if his demands were not met. Charlotte's plan had been diabolical in its sophistication. She had prepared the poison using her extensive botanical knowledge, arranged for its delivery through the manipulated tea service, and carefully planted evidence to implicate her stepmother while simultaneously preparing alternative explanations that would muddy the investigation. Her goal had been not just to eliminate the threat Reed represented, but to ensure that even if murder was suspected, the blame would fall elsewhere. As the full scope of Charlotte's deception became clear, Miss Marple reflected on the psychological forces that had driven a seemingly gentle young woman to such calculated violence. The desire to protect her stepmother, combined with the desperation of someone facing financial and social ruin, had transformed Charlotte's botanical interests into instruments of death and her intimate knowledge of village social dynamics into tools of misdirection. The investigation had revealed not just a murder, but a complex web of family loyalty, financial desperation, and psychological manipulation that had turned a quiet English village into the stage for a crime of remarkable sophistication. As Inspector Craddock prepared for the formal charges that would follow, Miss Marple found herself contemplating once again how the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood not just how to commit murder, but how to manipulate the very process of justice that sought to expose them. Charlotte's formal confession, while detailed in its admission of guilt, left Inspector Craddock with the peculiar sensation that he was hearing a carefully rehearsed performance, rather than the spontaneous unburdening of a guilty conscience. As the young woman recounted her elaborate plan to eliminate Mr. Reed while implicating her stepmother, her responses carried the measured cadence of someone who had prepared for exactly these questions, anticipating each inquiry with answers that were perhaps too perfectly constructed. Miss Marple, observing from her quiet corner, noticed how Charlotte's emotional displays seemed to follow a predictable pattern. rising and falling at precisely the moments when such reactions would be most convincing. More tellingly, when Inspector Craddock asked specific questions about the botanical preparation methods, Charlotte's answers revealed gaps in her knowledge that seemed inconsistent with someone who had supposedly orchestrated such a sophisticated poisoning single-handedly. Dr. Lennox, who had remained to witness the proceedings, raised a concern that would prove crucial to understanding the true scope of the deception. Inspector, while Miss Vale clearly possesses considerable botanical knowledge, I'm troubled by certain aspects of our chemical analysis. The precision of the alkaloid concentration suggests access to pharmaceutical-grade extraction equipment and detailed medical records that would not typically be available in a domestic setting. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Charlotte's carefully maintained narrative began to show hairline cracks. Her face displayed not the relief of someone finally unburdening herself of guilt, but the calculating expression of someone reassessing their strategy in light of unexpected complications. "Perhaps I have oversimplified certain aspects of the preparation," she admitted with obvious reluctance. "The situation was more complex than I initially indicated." Miss Marple, sensing that they were approaching the heart of the deception that had guided the entire investigation, decided to employ the gentle but penetrating psychological approach that had served her so well in previous cases. "My dear Charlotte, when you speak of protecting your stepmother from Mr. Reed's threats, are you quite certain that Hester was entirely unaware of your activities? It seems rather remarkable that such an elaborate plan could be executed without the knowledge of someone so intimately familiar with household routines and botanical preparations." The effect of this seemingly innocent question was devastating. Charlotte's composure cracked completely, and for the first time since the investigation began, her emotional responses appeared genuinely spontaneous rather than carefully managed. "She knew," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the mantel clock. "Hester knew everything from the beginning. The poison preparation, the evidence placement, even the confession I just gave you. She guided every step of it." This revelation transformed the entire understanding of the crime and the investigation that had followed it. Mrs. Vale had not been the intended victim of Charlotte's deception, but rather its architect. The older woman's extensive knowledge of botanical chemistry, combined with her sophisticated understanding of social manipulation and investigative procedures, had been used to create a murder plot of remarkable complexity. One designed not just to eliminate Mr. Reed, but to ensure that even if the crime were discovered, the investigation would be systematically misdirected. Inspector Craddock immediately dispatched Constable Rowan to bring Mrs. Vale for immediate questioning, but when he returned, his expression carried the grim news that the older woman had anticipated this development with characteristic precision. She had departed Vale House early that morning, ostensibly for an extended visit to relatives in Edinburgh, leaving instructions with the household staff that she was not to be disturbed for several weeks. Her sudden departure, timed to coincide exactly with Charlotte's confession, revealed the same meticulous planning that had characterized the murder itself. Charlotte's role in the elaborate deception, while significant, had been that of a devoted but ultimately subordinate participant. Mrs. Vale had exploited her stepdaughter's botanical interests, her desperate loyalty, and her genuine fear of financial and social ruin to create both an accomplice and a potential scapegoat. The evidence planting, the misdirection of the investigation, and even Charlotte's carefully prepared confession had all been orchestrated by Mrs. Vale as insurance against discovery. Miss Marple, reviewing the pattern of evidence with this new understanding, reflected on the psychological sophistication that had been required to manipulate not just the physical aspects of the crime, but the entire investigative process that followed. Mrs. Vale had demonstrated an understanding of human nature that went far beyond simple botanical knowledge, showing how the most dangerous criminals were often those who could manipulate the very systems designed to expose them. The search of Mrs. Vale's private study, conducted with appropriate legal authority, revealed the true extent of her involvement and planning. Hidden behind a false panel in her writing desk, investigators discovered detailed notes about Mr. Reed's medical condition and daily habits, correspondence with a London pharmaceutical supplier regarding botanical extracts, and most damning of all, a leather-bound journal that documented her methodical progression from considering various solutions to the blackmail problem toward the calculated decision to commit murder. The journal entries, written in Mrs. Vale's precise handwriting, revealed a mind that had moved with chilling logic from moral consideration to practical planning. She had not acted in passion or desperation, but had weighed the consequences of murder against the social and financial costs of exposure, ultimately deciding that Mr. Reed's elimination was not just preferable but necessary for the preservation of her carefully constructed life. As evening settled over Street Mary Mead and the full scope of Mrs. Vale's deception became clear, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the psychological forces that had driven a woman of apparent respectability to such calculated violence. The desire to protect her social position and financial security, combined with her intellectual pride in her botanical and chemical knowledge, had created a criminal mind capable of extraordinary manipulation and ruthless planning. Inspector Craddock, preparing for the manhunt that would inevitably follow, recognized that he was dealing with a criminal intelligence far more sophisticated than the typical village murder case. Mrs. Vale's careful preparation extended well beyond the crime itself, suggesting that her escape had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized the murder plot. The final confrontation, when it came, would require not just efficient police procedure, but the kind of psychological understanding that could outmaneuver someone who had proven herself capable of manipulating everyone around her, including those who loved and trusted her most. The investigation had revealed not just a murder, but a masterclass in criminal psychology that had nearly succeeded in its goal of perfect concealment. Only Miss Marple's instinctive suspicion of solutions that appeared too obvious, combined with her careful attention to the behavioral details that others had overlooked, had prevented Mrs. Vale's complete escape from justice. As the village settled into an uneasy quiet, the residents of Street Mary Mead were left to contemplate how someone they had known and respected had hidden such a capacity for calculated evil beneath the mask of genteel respectability. The manhunt for Mrs. Vale began with the methodical efficiency that Inspector Craddock brought to all his investigations. Yet within hours, it became clear that they were pursuing someone who had anticipated every conventional approach to capture. The railway stations reported no elegant lady matching her description. The motor hire services had no record of her patronage. And even the most thorough search of Edinburgh's boarding houses and hotels yielded nothing more substantial than polite denials and genuinely puzzled expressions from proprietors who had never heard the name Vale. Miss Marple, observing Inspector Craddock's growing frustration from her quiet corner in the vicarage study, reflected on the psychological profile of someone who had orchestrated such an elaborate deception. Mrs. Vale had demonstrated not just criminal cunning, but the kind of intellectual pride that would make complete disappearance psychologically impossible. Such a woman would not flee in panic, but would remain close enough to observe the aftermath of her carefully constructed drama, perhaps even taking satisfaction in watching the confusion she had created. Bernard Pratt's arrival with crucial observations confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about the true nature of Mrs. Vale's departure. The head gardener, his loyalty to his employer now transformed into grim determination to see justice done, reported details that cast her supposed flight in an entirely different light. Her most treasured possessions remained undisturbed in their customary places. Her botanical reference books showed no signs of having been packed for travel, and most tellingly, her prize orchids had been carefully watered and tended before her departure. "She's not gone far," Bernard said with the quiet certainty of someone who had observed Mrs. Vale's habits for many years. "That woman wouldn't abandon her plants permanently, and she certainly wouldn't leave without her botanical journals. Whatever she's planning, she intends to return, or at least to maintain some connection to what she's built here." This insight prompted Miss Marple to consider the specific psychological forces that would drive Mrs. Vale's behavior. Someone who had taken such intellectual pride in orchestrating the perfect murder would not simply vanish into anonymity. The very qualities that had made her dangerous, her need for control and recognition of her superior intellect, would also make complete disappearance psychologically unbearable. "Inspector," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Mrs. Vale has demonstrated remarkable knowledge of botanical chemistry and considerable skill in psychological manipulation. Such talents are not easily abandoned, nor would someone of her intellectual vanity wish them to remain unrecognized. I suspect she has not fled, so much as relocated to a position where she can continue to exercise her particular abilities. Acting on this insight, Inspector Craddock began a more focused search that concentrated on botanical gardens, research facilities, and private estates within reasonable traveling distance, where someone with Mrs. Vale's expertise might find employment. The investigation also revealed a crucial detail that had been overlooked in the initial excitement of her departure. A small cottage on the outskirts of Much Benham had been rented under an assumed name by a woman whose description matched Mrs. Vale precisely. The breakthrough came when Miss Marple recalled a detail that had threaded through every aspect of the case, like a signature. The distinctive scent of violets had marked the evidence from the very beginning, from the handkerchief fragment in the mill pond to Charlotte's fallen note. It was, Miss Marple realized, Mrs. Vale's personal trademark, the kind of consistent detail that someone of her meticulous nature would maintain even under stress. With Inspector Craddock's permission, Miss Marple devised a psychological trap that would appeal directly to Mrs. Vale's intellectual vanity and her need to maintain control over the situation she had created. A carefully worded message, ostensibly from Charlotte but bearing the subtle linguistic markers that Mrs. Vale would recognize as authentic, was left at the Much Benham post office where Mrs. Vale had maintained her secret correspondence. The message referenced a danger to the crematorium records that had implicated Mr. Reed, suggesting that final evidence needed to be eliminated to ensure complete security. The evening of the planned rendezvous brought Inspector Craddock and his men to positions around Hartwell and Sons, where the shadows of yew trees provided perfect concealment for those who knew where to watch. Miss Marple positioned herself near the rear gate, understanding that Mrs. Vale's approach would be cautious but confident, guided by the same intellectual arrogance that had driven her to believe she could orchestrate the perfect crime. As the appointed hour approached, the faint but unmistakable scent of violets drifted through the evening air, announcing Mrs. Vale's presence before she became visible. When she finally emerged from the deeper shadows beyond the yews, moving with the careful precision of someone accustomed to passing unnoticed, Miss Marple observed not panic or desperation, but the calculated movements of a mind still convinced of its own superiority. Mrs. Vale paused at the gate, her hand steady as she produced a key from her small leather case, her head tilted in assessment of the surroundings, with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her murder plot. Even in this moment of potential capture, she maintained the composure and intellectual pride that had driven her to such elaborate evil. "Good evening, Mrs. Vale," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying across the still air with gentle authority. "I believe you've come for the crematorium records, but I'm afraid you'll find that particular evidence has already been secured." The effect was immediate and telling. Mrs. Vale's hand tightened on the key, but her face showed not surprise, but the cold calculation of someone rapidly assessing new circumstances and potential responses. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she remained perfectly still, her mind clearly weighing options with the same ruthless logic she had applied to murder. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Vale said finally, her voice carrying its familiar cultured tones, despite the circumstances. "I should have anticipated that your reputation for insight was not merely village gossip." As Inspector Craddock and his men emerged from their concealment, Mrs. Vale's capture was accomplished without drama or resistance. She submitted to arrest with the same dignified composure she had maintained throughout her residence in Street Mary Mead, as if this too were merely another social obligation to be handled with appropriate grace. The psychological trap had succeeded not through force or cunning, but through Miss Marple's understanding of the fundamental human weakness that had driven Mrs. Vale to murder: the inability to resist demonstrating her intellectual superiority, even when such demonstration led directly to her downfall. As they prepared to return to the village for formal proceedings, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous criminals were often those who believed their intelligence placed them beyond the reach of conventional justice, never realizing that their very pride in that intelligence would ultimately provide the key to their capture. Mrs. Vale returned to the vicarage study with the same dignified composure she had maintained throughout her residence in Street Mary Mead, settling into the offered chair as if attending a social call rather than facing the collapse of an elaborate murder scheme. The faint scent of violets that had marked so much of the evidence lingered around her like a signature she could not quite erase, and Miss Marple observed how even in defeat, the woman projected the intellectual superiority that had driven her to believe she could orchestrate the perfect crime. Inspector Craddock arranged the evidence methodically across the desk. The brown glass vial with its perfect wooden stopper, the charred fragments from the compost heap, the handkerchief bearing that distinctive fragrance. Each piece told part of a story that Mrs. Vale had carefully constructed to implicate others while concealing her own involvement. Mrs. Vale, Miss Marple began with gentle authority. Your plan was remarkable in its sophistication, but it contained one fatal flaw. You could not resist demonstrating your intellectual superiority, even when discretion would have served you better. The older woman's pale eyes met Miss Marple's steadily, betraying neither surprise nor remorse, only the cool assessment of someone whose carefully laid plans had been systematically unraveled. The motive was blackmail, of course, Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the certainty of long observation. Reed had discovered financial irregularities in your late husband's estate. Irregularities you had concealed to protect both your reputation and your security. His demands became increasingly unreasonable as he recognized the power his knowledge provided. Charlotte, summoned for this final revelation, stood pale beside the door, her face reflecting the growing horror of understanding how completely she had been manipulated by the woman she had sought to protect. The murder itself required remarkable planning, Miss Marple explained methodically. You studied Mr. Reed's habits for months, noting his tendency to drink tea immediately without additions, his preference for certain china patterns, his predictable behavior at social gatherings. The concentrated monkshood extract was prepared with pharmaceutical precision, using equipment and knowledge far beyond Charlotte's capabilities, despite your careful efforts to suggest otherwise. Mrs. Vale's confession, when it finally came, was delivered with the same measured precision she had brought to every aspect of the crime. She acknowledged the blackmail that had motivated her actions. Reed's threats with clinical detachment, as if discussing an unpleasant but necessary business transaction. The decision to eliminate him was logical, she stated with chilling calm. Someone of his limited intelligence should never have been permitted to hold such power over his betters. The method was simply a matter of applying appropriate knowledge to solve a practical problem. The revelation of how thoroughly Charlotte had been manipulated added another layer of tragedy to the complex case. Mrs. Vale had exploited her stepdaughter's botanical interests, her desperate loyalty, and her genuine fear of ruin to create both an accomplice and a potential scapegoat. Even Charlotte's prepared confession had been scripted to serve Mrs. Vale's purposes, designed to satisfy official requirements while concealing the true extent of her stepmother's involvement. Every piece of evidence pointing toward Charlotte was deliberately placed, Miss Marple explained to Inspector Craddock. The botanical notes, the reddened fingers from handling caustic plant materials, even the timing of her nervous behavior. Mrs. Vale understood that investigators would follow the most obvious trail, especially when it was laid out with such convincing detail. Charlotte's anguish at discovering her role in the elaborate deception was heartbreaking to witness. I thought I was protecting you, she whispered to her stepmother, her voice breaking with the weight of betrayal. I thought we were protecting each other. You thought, Mrs. Vale replied with devastating coldness. But I arranged. Thinking without arrangement is merely sentiment. The distinction, so boldly stated, removed any remaining ambiguity about the true nature of their relationship and the calculated manipulation that had driven every aspect of the crime. As Inspector Craddock prepared the formal charges, Mrs. Vale received them with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout, as if this too were merely another social obligation to be handled with appropriate grace. Her intellectual pride remained intact even in defeat, suggesting that she viewed the crime itself as a demonstration of superior capabilities rather than a moral failure. Miss Marple, rising from her chair with characteristic gentleness, offered one final observation. "You miscalculated not in chemistry or psychology, Mrs. Vale, but in understanding that true intelligence includes wisdom about one's own limitations. Pride, like your beloved roses, requires constant tending, but unlike roses, it grows most dangerous when it blooms in isolation." The investigation had revealed not just a murder, but a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that had nearly succeeded through the exploitation of family loyalty and the careful misdirection of official inquiry. As Mrs. Vale was led away into the gathering dusk, Mary Mead was left to contemplate how someone they had known and respected had hidden such capacity for calculated evil beneath the mask of genteel respectability. The days following Mrs. Vale's arrest settled over Mary Mead with the peculiar mixture of relief and disquiet that follows the resolution of a great mystery. The village, which had held its breath through the investigation, began to exhale slowly, though conversations at the post office and the grocer's carried a new undertone of thoughtful caution. People moved with a gentler consideration for one another, as if the revelation of such calculated evil in their midst had reminded them of the fragility of the peace they had taken for granted. Charlotte Vale departed before the week's end, unable to bear the weight of remaining in the house where she had been so thoroughly manipulated. Her destination was her aunt's cottage in the Lake District, where the clear air and honest work of tending sheep would provide the distance she needed from the psychological devastation of discovering how completely her love and loyalty had been exploited. Before leaving, she made arrangements for Vale House to be sold, with the proceeds to establish a fund for village improvements, a gesture that spoke more eloquently than words of her desire to transform something poisonous into something beneficial. Bernard Pratt accepted a position with the Botanical Gardens in Much Benham, his expertise in horticulture unmarked by the criminal uses to which botanical knowledge had been put. His final act at Vale House was to carefully destroy the monkshood that had grown there for generations, ensuring that no future resident would face the temptation or danger it represented. In its place, he planted a small bed of white roses, explaining to Miss Marple that sometimes the best memorial was the promise that such beauty would never again be perverted to serve such darkness. Mrs. Vale's trial, conducted in the autumn assizes, revealed the full extent of her crimes to a shocked public. Her detailed journals, discovered during the thorough search of her belongings, documented not just the planning of Mr. Reed's murder, but years of subtle manipulation and financial irregularities that painted a picture of a woman who had viewed those around her as pieces to be moved in service of her own interests. The judge's sentencing noted with particular severity the coldness of someone who had exploited family bonds to commit murder while preparing to sacrifice those who loved her most. She received life imprisonment, accepting the verdict with the same composed dignity she had maintained throughout, as if this too were merely another social obligation to be handled with appropriate grace. Inspector Craddock's final report would stand as a testament to methodical police work, though he privately acknowledged to Miss Marple that the case had challenged his understanding of criminal psychology in ways that would influence his future investigations. Before his departure, he sought her out to express his gratitude with straightforward sincerity. "You have a way, Miss Marple," he admitted, "of seeing into the very heart of things that the rest of us often overlook." Dr. Lennox resumed his quiet medical practice with a deepened appreciation for the complexity of human nature, while Mr. Blunt returned to his chemistry with renewed respect for the responsibility that came with specialized knowledge. Lily Finch found permanent employment with the Reverend's household, her natural competence unmarked by her brief involvement in the tragic events, and her courage in finally speaking the truth properly acknowledged by those who mattered most. The Ashbourne Rose, Mr. Reed's final horticultural achievement, was quietly removed from the vicarage garden and destroyed along with the contaminated soil that had nurtured it. Yet Bernard, with the old gardener's reluctance to let any plant end without proper trial, had taken a cutting before the destruction. Planted in clean earth at the edge of his potting shed, it had rooted and grown, and when it finally bloomed, its color proved less dramatic than its parents. It was simply red, ordinary and sound, with about it the steadiness of something no longer trying to astonish. As autumn deepened and the village prepared for the changing seasons, Miss Marple returned to her quiet observations from her cottage window. The case had reminded her once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those who possessed genuine intelligence, but lacked the wisdom to understand that true superiority lay not in manipulating others, but in using one's gifts to benefit rather than harm. Mrs. Vale had demonstrated remarkable knowledge of botanical chemistry and considerable skill in psychological manipulation, yet had failed to grasp the fundamental truth that such talents, when divorced from empathy and moral restraint, became instruments of destruction rather than creation. The evening brought the Reverend to call, carrying with him a small pot containing a cutting from his own garden. He explained with gentle humor, bred for hardiness rather than drama. "I thought you might appreciate something that blooms reliably without requiring exotic soil amendments." Miss Marple accepted the gift with genuine pleasure, settling it on her windowsill where the afternoon light would reach it. As she prepared her evening tea, she reflected that, perhaps the real lesson of the rose that bloomed in ash was that genuine beauty required honest soil and patient tending, not the dramatic shortcuts that promised quick results through questionable means. In gardens, as in human character, the most lasting achievements came through steady care rather than spectacular innovation. The village would remember this case not for its intended celebration of horticultural achievement, but as a reminder that even in the most peaceful settings, human nature could harbor depths of calculation and cruelty that challenged comfortable assumptions about respectability and moral character. Yet it would also remember how truth, patiently sought and gently revealed, could restore the balance that deception had disturbed. Miss Marple poured her tea and took up her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the gathering dusk. Outside her window, street. Mary Mead settled into its evening routines with the quiet satisfaction of a community that had faced darkness and emerged whole. The eternal drama of human choice would continue to unfold, requiring nothing more than careful attention to reveal its deepest truths. But for now, peace had returned to their quiet corner of England, and that was sufficient. The case of the rose that bloomed in ash had ended, but Miss Marple knew that human nature would continue to provide mysteries for those wise enough to observe and patient enough to understand. In her small garden, the peace rose would grow in its own time, tended with honest care, a living reminder that the most beautiful things in life were also often the most simple and true.